In the sultry pine-laced wilderness of Spanish Florida, nestled along the Apalachicola River, there once stood a defiant symbol of black resistance to slavery and white supremacy, Negro Fort. More than a military post, this fortified sanctuary became a beacon of freedom, a rallying point for hundreds of fugitive slaves, free blacks, and their Native American allies who had rejected the brutal chains of the American slave system. It stood as a living declaration that black people were willing to fight and die for their right to live free. Yet in 1816, this bastion of liberation would be reduced to ashes in a single apocalyptic moment. The Battle of Negro Fort, so often minimized in the American historical memory, was no mere skirmish. It was a pivotal, violent episode in the centuries-long struggle for black freedom in the Americas. Negro Fort was originally constructed by the British during the War of 1812. British forces, seeking alliances with native peoples and the rebellious enslaved Africans, built the fort as a military outpost to challenge U.S. expansion. But when the British withdrew after the war, they left behind a well-armed fort and promised the black and native allies that they could keep it. For over a year, the fort became a thriving refuge for those who had escaped the iron jaws of slavery. Some were Maroons, Africans who had escaped bondage and survived for generations in the swamps and wilderness of Florida. Others were recent fugitives from Georgia, the Carolinas, and beyond. Together, with support from the Seminole and Creek people, they turned the fort into a symbol of defiance. They cultivated land, trained militarily, and prepared for what many knew was inevitable: American retaliation. To the United States government and Southern slaveholders, Negro Fort was an existential threat. Its very existence inspired enslaved people to flee. It was a constant reminder that armed black people could not only survive, but thrive outside of white control. General Andrew Jackson, already infamous for his genocidal campaigns against Native Americans, ordered the destruction of the fort. Under the guise of suppressing lawlessness and protecting Georgia planters, Jackson sent U.S. troops and allied Creek warriors to destroy the fort. On July of 1816, U.S. naval forces under Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Clinch moved in. For days, the fort's defenders held strong, despite being outgunned and outnumbered. But on July 27, 1816, tragedy struck. A single well-aimed cannonball, fired from a gun post on the river, hit the fort's powder magazine. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. Reports say the blast was heard hundreds of miles away. Over 270 men, women, and children were killed instantly. Survivors were captured, re-enslaved, or executed. The destruction of Negro Fort was not just a military action. It was a message. It signaled that any place of refuge for black people outside of white control would be hunted and destroyed. It was an early example of the U.S. government's willingness to use extreme violence to uphold slavery. But though the fort was destroyed, its spirit lived on. The Seminole Wars, sparked in part by this very event, would rage for decades. Black warriors would fight alongside Native allies in the swamps of Florida, refusing to return to chains. They became known as the Black Seminoles, and their legacy of armed resistance echoed from the Everglades to the abolitionist struggle of the Civil War. Today, the Battle of Negro Fort remains one of the most undertaught and underappreciated episodes in American history. It was a tragic but powerful moment that illustrated both the terrifying reach of American militarism and the courageous refusal of black people to accept bondage. Negro Fort was not merely destroyed, it was erased from the national consciousness. But as black historians, we reconstruct it. We honor the men, women, and children who lived, fought, and died in the fortress for a freedom they had already claimed for themselves. This was not simply a battle. It was black resistance in its most radical and uncompromising form. And it will be remembered. To all the men, women, and children who battled at Negro Fort, we proudly stand on your shoulders. For more information, please visit my website at www.ontheshoulders1.com. There, you can support my OTSOG book series. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/OTSOG. You can also support me by hitting the like button under this video. I love you all, and make sure you catch the next video coming up.